Welcome everyone, and this is the video online version of me talking to you. Apologies for this and for showing you some videos instead of me talking over the slides during this first part of this session, but I had a commitment that was made known to me on Thursday afternoon, if not Friday, and that I could not get away from. So the video, the commitment should leave me enough time to return at my desk and by 1 o'clock and be able to deliver this in person. If you see this, it means that actually that was not the case. So just to avoid any risk, I thought I should prepare some videos so that the first half of this lecture is covered. It was a first half in which I was going to go anyway through a few conceptual points about the topic of today, relief development continuum. But if all goes well, I should kind of join you in your Zoom session and be watching some of these videos myself with you. I will for sure be present in the second part of the session, which indeed will begin with a Q&A just to catch up on the few things that I said on these videos and see if you have any questions. So apologies, but these are how things go nowadays. In fact, our new director seems to be speaking only via video communiques, and so I'm trying to copy him and do the same with you here. Now, joking aside, and on the technical side, I prepared 3 short videos rather than a long one as a way of kind of making more manageable the files. If all goes well, I should be able to upload them to YouTube, and you will be watching this through a link that I will provide with my general email where I will announce this. Okay, so again, apologies, but don't despair. You will see me and you have the chance to ask me questions in about 50 minutes or so. So what do we do today? I kind of end my block with you, and in that respect, I'm going to carry on with a case study that we looked at last week, and I'm going to think about the ways in which what we have been discussing about humanitarian space, refugee assistance, the field that is created around the refugee definition, as much as the changing policies associated to protection and assistance, and indeed management and treatment of asylum seekers and refugees that we explored last week under the heading humanitarian border. How do they fare, or what happens when the so-called refugee cycle ends? Or at the very least, since the notion of refugee cycle is kind of passé, nobody uses it anymore because it was a very functional way of thinking about refugee displacement. What happens when, well, refugees are no longer refugees, when they are returnees, when they have to or want to return home? Or actually, what happens when the refugee assistance phase ends and there is a need to produce, and obviously a need to produce, it's a very it's an expression that is very much shaped by policy imperatives rather than my own way of thinking about all of this. So what happens after refugee aid kicks in and needs to be phased out for whatever reason, right? So here is when notions of development or ideas about linking refugee aid and development come to the fore. What happens with returnees nowadays, as we will see in the second part of this session? One of the major ways of solving the so-called European migration crisis is that of promoting voluntary repatriation schemes. So on one side, as we saw last week, the objective was to actually prevent asylum seekers from reaching European shores through a variety of means that we explored last week, but some did arrive. In fact, quite a few, if you remember the figures that with which we started last week's session. So what happens to them? How do we policymakers plan for their future? What kind of activities, policies, programs, projects are we to set up as a way of either facilitating their stay in Europe under the new status, or indeed facilitating their return to their country of origin. And as we will see, development pervades all of these dimensions. And it's kind of a process that captures the entirety, or at least this is what I will argue in the second half of the session. It captures kind of the entirety of the so-called refugee cycle. More specifically, today we're going to look at the relief development continuum by thinking about three separate issues, each of which will be the subject of one of these videos, if you wish. The first, we're going to try and think about why, or the moment, the historical moment in which relief came to be thought of as something that needed to be linked to development, right? To development interventions. I mean, throughout the Cold War, this was not the case. And I mean, again, if you accept my argument that major shifts and transformation in the humanitarian protection and assistance regimes for refugees are deeply embedded in geopolitical context and historical moments, well, then as you will accept the fact that it was at the end of the Cold War, so in the 1990s, that new ideas and profound transformations came to characterize the refugee protection and assistance regime, or at least the discourses, the policy debates associated to what to do about refugees. Right? So we're going to look at the 90s as a key moment in which relief and development came to be thought of as something that needed more integration, something that needed to be thought as a unitary process of assistance. And we're going to look at some specific examples of the ways in which refugee assistance, refugee aid was delivered in the name or with attached concerns related to development. And then, again, I'm going to try and think about all of this in different ways in the second part, so live, by using a case study to think about, well, really to question all of these policy propositions and transformations by providing a much, well, in my perspective, or in my opinion, or from my perspective, a much richer analytical understanding of what development is about. Okay, so the argument, in a sense, remains the same as the last 2 weeks. We need to think about humanitarian space, the humanitarian border, or indeed the ways in which refugees and development can be conceptually and policy-wise linked. We need to think about them in context or in relation to a whole series of other social processes and contexts that shape, well, if you wish, the logics that put together relief and development, the discourses, best practices, the experts and consultants that inform the practical implementation of these logics and rationales, and indeed to think about them in relation to experiences and outcomes. Okay, so the argument remained the same. Obviously, there will be subsets of arguments, mostly, as I anticipated already, those related to a shift in the way in which we perceive development that somehow undermines everything that was said until then. Okay, so let me start. Now, as I said, the key moment of transformation was the 1990s, right? In the 1980s, again, if you go by B.S. Chimney's thesis, the refugee regime was, well, a regime primarily set up to assist populations fleeing from the consequences of either Soviet occupations or civil war with governments or factions or parties affiliated to the Soviet regime. It was effectively a refugee regime, which by no means exclusively, but in terms of its actual funding and organization, was heavily reliant on on Cold War logics. I want to take you back to 2 sessions ago when I talked about food distributions in refugee camps in Pakistan for Afghan refugees. And I want you to remember the way in which I described the way in which refugees could only become refugees by registering in one of the political parties. I want to remind you about the organization and logistics of food distributions that was heavily reliant on military organizations for its transport and delivery. I want to remind you more broadly about the way in which we discussed funding and the fact that in the middle of the 80s, the refugee assistance program for Afghan refugees in Pakistan could command a budget of $1 million per day, okay? And how by the beginning of the 90s, so between 1990 and 1992, that dropped by almost 60-70% in spite of unchanged, in fact, some would argue worsening conditions experienced by Afghans in Pakistan, right? So this is to say that one major context of transformation relates to the changing priorities of the so-called international community and how those priorities reflected, well, at the very least, in the drying up of funds for Afghan refugees. For the refugee regime in general and more broadly. This is a quote from a 2006 United Nations document that says that, look, given the increasing numbers of famines and natural disasters, especially in Africa, the insight asserted itself in development cooperation in the 1980s that the separate treatment of relief, rehabilitation, and development aid had to be overcome. At the time, the development experts were still setting out from the assumption that humanitarian aid only needed to be offered in emergency situations, and that one would subsequently continue with development cooperation. Towards the end of the 80s, in view of the increasing number of internal violent conflicts, the United Nations suggested that humanitarian aid, rehabilitation, and development cooperation need not to be organized in a temporal sequence. So again, try and think about these grand statements in relation to concrete situations. I mean, you have to think about, first of all, how refugee aid was still distributed or disbursed through emergency logics for well over a decade. Take, again, sorry, I go back to the example of Afghan refugees, but throughout the 1980s, ultimately, refugees were fed through food distributions. They were schooled. They were kept in ever embellished and even ever more comfortable refugee camps, to the point that they came to be known as refugee villages, because they became settlements in themselves. But this was only under the formal arrangement that they were recognized as refugees, that there was funding that was flowing through the UN system and a few other international organizations that was supported by the government of Pakistan, and that, well, refugees were somewhat detached from the rest of society or development. There were some concerns, as we will see later, and as one of your core readings by Evan Estons talks about ways in which the let's say the costs, as they were called back then, of the stay of Afghan refugees in Pakistan could be alleviated, and some development programs hiring refugees came to be prefigured. But ultimately, the idea throughout the 80s was that, well, this is a refugee emergency program. The most important thing is to protect the protection of refugees, i.e., the protection from returning to their country, protection from authorities, and indeed protection in terms of, well, feeding, housing, clothing, and so on and so forth. But it was clear by the end of the 80s that Afghan refugees were nowhere near their return to Afghanistan. In fact, a civil war ensued that made it, I mean, and to this day, still a chimera of a full return or repatriation of Afghan refugees. The same could be said about many refugee situations in other places, in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere. The change in the geopolitical context that I described before also meant that, well, those big donors perhaps were less interested in, well, spending the same amounts of money, which for them during the 80s had a strategic value other than a purely humanitarian value. And the strategic value, as I said, was the role that many refugee caseloads played in relation to the Cold War. So once again, it is interesting to think about and dissect policy debates, as I will do in the next few slides, but a reminder of always trying to set things in context, okay? So again, what is the basic idea? Well, the basic idea is simple and sensible. Buchanan and Smith write in 1994. 1994 was a major workshop at the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex, in which that key tension between relief and development activities was tackled and was discussed. And a lot of the changes that occurred since then were really kind of partly reflected, partly proposed in that workshop. The starting point is that emergencies are costly in terms of human life and resources. They're disruptive of development. They demand a long period of rehabilitation, and they have spawned bureaucratic structures, lines of communication, and organizational cultures which duplicate development institutions and sometimes cut across them. By the same token, development policy and administration are often insensitive to the risk of drought and the importance of protecting vulnerable households against risks. So you can read it by yourself, but the point is that on one side, the main claim or the basic idea, simple and sensible basic idea, is that relief cannot be thought of as something that happens now and we will think about development in the future. The idea is to link the two. I mean, to come up with a series of projects, programs, ways of delivering refugee aid that already have in mind development or ideas of self-sufficiency, ideas of income generation, protection of household livelihoods, as we will see. Okay, so this was the basic idea. On the other side, the other part of the basic idea is that also development interventions, which back then, remember, it was mostly about import substitution, industrialization, large state-directed investment, they were saying that, look, also those kind of interventions are less sensitive to the risk of emergencies, to the risk of droughts, to the risk of livelihood opportunities drying up, or indeed to the risk of conflict. So that space, if you wish, right, that humanitarian space that we talked about 2 weeks ago came to be increasingly thought as a humanitarian/development space, as a space that could not be separated, that needed to work together to achieve maximum impact. Better development can reduce the need for emergency relief. Better relief can contribute to development. And better rehabilitation can ease any remaining tension between the two. The great word of policymakers. So, look, I think I mentioned these slides already. I mean, all of these need to be set in context. There was a changing nature of emergencies. I mean, there was many more unanticipated shocks than the ones that were expected to follow on the end of the Cold War, and there were discussions about the peace dividend and the fact that, well, history had ended in the famous expression by Fukuyama. There were, as I mentioned already, protracted refugee situations that, well, did not conform to the abstract cycle of displacement, relief, and return, or integration. And indeed, the excesses associated to the Cold War in terms of refugee aid budget were beginning to, well, to be felt or certainly be discussed in a context in which, well, priorities had changed. And this changing context translated in changing policy views, such as the one that kind of rendered concrete that basic idea expressed in the IDS workshop. What kind of policy views? Well, the ones expressed in major policy documents. I mean, UNDP began with this continuum project, right? So UNDP came to be involved in, well, emergency relief activities. UNHCR, more difficult so, but certainly there were debates within UNHCR about the need to expand their developmental awareness and the need to, well, think about protection also in developmental terms, not only in terms of protection from refoulement, from arbitrary detention, and so on and so forth, but as an activity that will lead or that is constitutive and builds toward development and future development opportunities, right? The ODI as well talked about or made another workshop on the relief development continuum. Again, from the IDS, well, one of the working papers that emerged from the workshop in 1994 says development and relief often operate across purposes with different objectives, cultures, and modes of operations. Change, which leads to mutual reinforcement of the two, is an attractive, even a necessary idea, though problematic in the growing number of cases where emergencies are related to conflict. So the idea that you could distinguish between relief phase, rehabilitation phase, and development phase, well, effectively came to be discredited, much like the idea of refugee cycle of displacement, relief and protection, and return, or more broadly, durable solution, right? So changing context, changing ideas, and indeed changing programs. The UNDP is one, through the Continuum project is one example. Many international NGOs also began to think about refugee relief and development in similar ways. UNHCR, as usual, much more, well, much more caught up in politics. If anything, I mean, even their budget structure, being considered an organization mostly dealing with emergencies and refugee emergencies, the structure of the budget means that they have to apply every year for budgetary support, right, for funds. I mean, UNDP, on the contrary, works on a 5-year project. I mean, again, still minimal compared to the development needs of many communities and countries, but already tells you how much more difficult it is for UNHCR to embark on such operations. Okay. Let me stop here for the purposes of making manageable videos.